It's the campaign the entire state is now watching, certainly now, with an incumbent facing stiff opposition. If the geography of the district hasn't changed in a decade, has its ideology shifted? Well, he's a cinch bet to carry Arkansas in November, but is President Trump's performance a bit unsettling for some of the state's voters? And amid a pandemic, a consideration of balloting and turnout, in person or absentee. Arkansas Week coming up.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. If Arkansas isn't in play in the presidential sweepstakes, if the only statewide incumbent on the ballot appears reasonably secure, there are still some races to consider. But the week began with a high-frequency buzz. A poll by the Talk Business and Politics website and the Hendrix College survey team reported a statistical tie in the 2nd Congressional District, where Republican Representative French Hill is seeking a 4th term. His opponent, State Senator Joyce Elliott, a Democrat making her 2nd bid for Congress. Joining us for this edition, Dr. Jay Barth, part of the team that conducted the Talk Business poll. He is reliably reported to lean left. To the starboard side, former State Representative John Burris, now a consultant and lobbyist. And somewhere in between, Dr. Heather Yates of the Political Science faculty at the University of Central Arkansas. Thanks to everybody for coming in. Jay, we'll begin with you, though. We've become accustomed over the past decade, if not longer, for Pulaski County driving the numbers, at least on the Democratic side anyway, in the race in the 2nd Congressional District. You think you're picking up something a bit more than that, though, in this last survey?
Yeah, and I think obviously other surveys and ultimately the decision by the voters before and on November 3rd will determine. But what we have begun to see is some improvement for the Democrats' position in the Trump era in those counties most immediately to the north and the south of Pulaski County, Saline to the south, Faulkner to the north, where many of the residents spend their time in Little Rock, work in Little Rock, although they may be zooming into their office at the moment. They're increasingly likely to be in professional jobs and thus be better educated than the folks who lived in those counties 10, 15 years ago. So I think something is happening. What we are seeing in this survey is that in contrast to 2016, when Hillary Clinton got 25% in Saline County, 31% in Faulkner County, in both those counties, Joe Biden is now into the upper 30s. And the 2nd district race is very much tethered to that presidential race, and we see Joyce Elliott's numbers really matching Joe Biden's, while Biden is doing a little bit better actually in Pulaski County than her, which suggests she has a little bit of room to grow in both candidates' home counties.
All right, John Burris, your thoughts.
I think that the math that Jay laid out is probably accurate. It's no secret that Trump is not appealing to a demographic that, someone like a Mitt Romney or a John McCain might have won. His rhetoric turns a lot of people off. Flip side, it motivates people. And so if from a different type. And I think that Congressman Hill will win re-election. I do. I think it's probably tighter than it was in years past because of that, pro and con of Trump. And it will catch up with Republicans in other areas, I think, and in other states. But I think in the end, Congressman Hill's done a good job, and I think that there's a lot of votes in those outlying counties. And while I served with Senator Elliott and I have a lot of respect for her as a person, I just think these national elections become about national issues. And right now, I think Congressman Hill better represents the district.
Well, John, well, to everybody, is it possible to say that anything is driving these numbers in the 2nd District except Mr. Trump? The virus, the economy, anything else? Or is it all of a piece? John?
I personally believe it's all national. I mean, I don't think there's anything. I think Congressman Hill's done a good job. I don't think Senator Elliott has really ran that many ads of her own to this point. I think any movement you see on the numbers is a result of the national dynamic. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, okay. Heather Yates.
I think we have multi-factors playing out here. I think there's a lot of nationalization of politics affecting the down ballot race, and we're seeing that movement. I do think that we have Donald Trump's personality being a driver in more of the rural areas of the district, because we also see in a lot of demographics that rural residents correlates with strong faith-based voting, and there's a lot of faith-based voters that are grappling with Donald Trump's leadership style, his extreme rhetoric, with their own personal faith. So I think that's a driver. I do think that the national health crisis, the pandemic, is also a driver. I also think that we can't discount the impact of racial antagonism in this nation. This summer had a really rough summer in the nation and in Little Rock. And I think that some of those racial dynamics are also correlating with everything that we've seen up to this point since 2016. And voters are scrutinizing this election much differently because voters in the 2nd District, voters in Arkansas are experiencing politics right now in ways that they haven't experienced it before. Yes, there is the COVID-19 infection rates. That is touching people's lives. We also have, like I said, the summer of racial antagonism around the nation after George Floyd's death in May. And so I think right now there is also a really historic component to the Arkansas 2nd District. Arkansas has not elected a Black woman to Congress before. So I think that there's multi-factors here. They are all coming together. Yes, there is the effect of nationalizing the down ballot ticket, but I also think that there's things going on the ground, the way that people are personally experiencing the pandemic and the way that they are personally experiencing the economic downturn are also going to be working its way up from the bottom up. So those things are going to meet in the middle in November.
Yeah, Jay Barth.
Well, I think a couple of things. I think that one other demographic factor that's going on is that I think that the younger Arkansans and I think residents of the 2nd District, and that is those folks under the age of 45, look more like their peers outside of Arkansas. In contrast, I think older Arkansans still tend to look quite different from their peers elsewhere, much more conservative. I think that whether it's on issues of race or on the environment, other things, I think younger voters looking much more similar to their peers elsewhere. I think that's one important point. I would also kind of respond to one thing that John said, which I think that to this point, Senator Elliott has done a good job of introducing herself by emphasizing her public school credentials. And I think especially in these suburban counties, Faulkner, Saline, but really all over the district, but I think it has particular resonance in those close-in counties. The public schools are really the centerpiece of those communities. And I think that it's a very positive symbol. And I think Elliott has done a very good job of kind of emphasizing her public school bona fides because of her 30 years of teaching and her advocacy in the legislature.
Yeah, over to John Burris. John, Heather brought up something interesting a moment ago, and that has been reflected elsewhere nationally in surveys of evangelicals, and that is there appears to be some erosion in that evangelical base of Mr. Trump's, which has been so critical to, or was so absolutely critical to him in 2016. Are you picking that up?
Probably, and I think that it's a result of things that he says and does, and then also, who becomes the face of this movement on a national level. But I mean, the other side is that I think that the Democrats are represented equally poorly on a national level, and that's going to motivate normal Arkansans who look at the national political scene as red and blue, which it often and almost always is. And so I do think that there's a little bit of more of a conflicted the voter on an evangelical, if you want to call that, or a social conservative side. But like I said, I think they stay at home because in the end, President Trump's appointed conservative judges. And if they look at what's going on in other places in the country, it scares them. I mean, I think there are legitimate points to be made about the leadership of the national party, and those are the ones that Congressman Hill is going to make, I'm sure, and they're fair points when you're running for national office. And so I think the more he makes those, I think the evangelicals and people in the end stay home, even if they're more skeptical of the national dynamic than they were in the past.
Yeah, one final question about the 2nd District, although it could apply statewide. We have not specifically talked about, narrowly anyway, about race in the United States in this political season, and it has been obviously a tumultuous year on that regard, or in that regard. Heather Yates, this is going to resonate?
Yeah, we're already seeing evidence where the question of the legacy of racial relations in this nation is resonating. We see it resonating across the nation in several other congressional districts, that it's actually motivated more candidates of color, more diverse candidates to throw their hat in the ring and declare their candidacy. We see this in the St. Louis area. We see this also in other areas in the Midwest, where traditionally we have not seen a legacy of diverse candidates. So that is resonating. Now, with regards to the voters' minds, voters are also scrutinizing their own values and ideologies across the spectrum, and that's becoming, that's being internalized, and that's becoming a very personal calculus that voters are applying. But it is resonating. It's also resonating in the evidence and the type of rhetoric our candidates are using. We're seeing the presidential candidates double down on some of this racial rhetoric. We're seeing Donald Trump double down on this right before Kamala Harris was announced as the VP candidate, that he also is appealing to white suburban identity. So we're seeing this resonate throughout several threads of the campaigns, all the way from candidate recruitment to the rhetoric that candidates are using to the own opinions and attitudes being expressed wherever they are from voters, whether we're capturing them in voter opinions, in surveys, or if we're just capturing them in qualitative data and open-ended questions. But it is resonating, and it is being threaded through a lot of interpretations about issues. And so, yeah, I think this is also something that's been nationalized, and it's something that the candidates, both Republican and Democrats, could not circumvent after May.
We'll come back to race in a moment when we discuss turnout. But, Heather, you've been looking, we've got already noted the obvious, which is Mr. Trump is the odds-on favorite in Arkansas. But the composition come January of the Arkansas Congressional delegation, with the possible exception of the 2nd District, the other three appear to be secure.
That is correct. They have safe districts. Correct. Yeah, safe districts. All three incumbents do not have really formidable challenges. We also see this emerge in their financial reports, their quarter 2 financial reports, that they are outraising and outspending their Democratic counterparts, in some cases their Libertarian challengers, 3-1, 4-1. And so that's also something that's very secure in the rest of the Arkansas delegation. And that's something too that we've known about Arkansas, is that the Arkansas 2nd District is largely always the potential to be the only purple district in the state. And that's certainly true of this cycle. But yeah, districts 1, 3, and 4 are secure red districts. Their campaign fundraising shows that, their campaign spending shows that, and confirms the solution. I mean the resolution, yeah.
Right. Okay. Now on to the matter of turnout. Jay Barth, we're voting, well, there's just confusion reigns, not just in Arkansas, but across the country. Whether to go to the polls, whether to request an absentee, what do you see the impact of that? Voting in 2020 in November, what's likely to happen in terms of participation? Jay?
Yeah, I think a big question mark, and it's both the overall numbers, but then also the how of voting. Do folks take what feels maybe a little bit like a risk and go with absentee in terms of the Postal Service's issues? Take a different risk and go to the polls with the health risk that may be associated with that, or decide it's all just a little too risky and stay home. This is a very different kind of a voting environment than it is historically, and to be determined what the demographic patterns are in terms of those decisions. So I think we have some big question marks. I think it is certainly in urban areas and suburban areas, both in central Arkansas and in Benton and Washington counties, where voters may feel kind of most conflicted. I think in rural areas, there is less of a sense of health risk. I think that, although I think that's not an accurate evaluation, but there is some sense of that, and I don't think that there will be as much disruption to the voting process as in these more densely populated areas. So folks are making very different decisions, and it's very interesting that a lot of campaigns for office this time, rather than talking about their candidates, are spending a lot of time talking about how to vote, and that's a different game, and we just don't know how all that's going to play out. And I think there's all kinds of big question marks as a result.
Yeah, well, Jay, does that apply, though, to race? And I want everybody to kick in on this, but, we were talking with Heather a second ago about race as an issue, as a dynamic this year. Obviously, Democrats are hoping for an enormous African-American and Latino turnout. Jay, do you think that the rhetoric of 2020 and the past 4 years from the White House is likely to animate African-American voters to a level that above previous years?
I think no doubt, and I think especially when you have a candidate like Citra Elliott, who would make history, that is another kind of local impetus for African Americans to turn out. On the other hand, I think we have some counter evidence that it is African Americans who are most concerned about the virus. It has had a disparate impact on the African American community and on other communities of color. We are seeing that in terms of decisions about whether students should be sent to school or not. We're seeing African American families deciding to keep students home at a slightly higher rate, at least in Little Rock. And that would be some evidence on the other side. So, it may all just kind of balance out, but there clearly are so many intangibles in this election, which makes it an election like no other.
John Burris, intangibles.
Yeah, I was going to say this is not science, but, it's a little bit of common sense building off of what Jay said. I think people are going to vote more of a factor of what they want their life to look like, and are they afraid that if Joe Biden is elected, are we going to shut down the economy again? Are schools going to close? Are they going to take away the things that I want? And in terms of how that affects voting, it's just common sense to say that if you're motivated to vote on those things, you are more motivated to go to the polls and actually vote because you're a little bit less unafraid versus someone who, while they might have their passions, have had their lives disrupted and maybe are more likely to stay at home or be unable to vote. All that said, what I'm trying to say is I think there's going to be a lot of motivation from people to vote, and the ones that are going to want to get to the polls are the ones that are more likely to vote for a Republican because they are less afraid of the economic and socioeconomic outcome if a Republican's elected in terms of COVID shutdowns and such. So I just think that's an advantage of the Republicans, and I think it's going to help Congressman Hill also.
Well, so Heather Yates, you see a wash as well, or what?
Well, when we're talking about voting, especially voting during a global pandemic, we're talking about a classic collective action problem. And there was the classic collective action problem in the 1918 pandemic to overcome. And yeah, there was lower voter turnout, but that was also a midterm election. There's also a world war happening at the same time. In 2020, we have a slightly different context. We've had the last 4 years of what seems to some is an aberration from conventional politics, but we also have the classic barriers to voting, and we also have a couple of other additional complications with the pandemic. When we're talking about voter turnout among different demographics, the demographics who have the most at risk also face the most barriers. They're the marginalized communities of color. We also have the classic transaction cost of voting, taking time off from work. Time does equate money. If you're in an hourly wage job versus a salary job, do you get time off from your job to go vote? Some companies give their employees time off, some do not. So we've got the classic collective action transaction costs, time, money, and then we've also got the health risks. And so in terms of what we saw in the primary in the spring, there were actually several states that did not postpone the election and had in-person voting. We're thinking about Wisconsin, and we actually saw higher voter turnout in some of those states. So if we are taking our cue from the primaries, what we might see is higher voter turnout despite these transaction costs, because as we all agree on, there's a lot at risk, and depending on which partisan perspective you are interpreting all your data through, the risks will look different. But both sides articulate that they feel equally motivated because there is a shared concern about the future. But what those futures look like are opposites right now. But at the end of the day, I do think that we are going to see a potential higher voter turnout than maybe 2016 because of what we saw in the spring primaries.
Other matters on the ballot. John Burris, the state Supreme Court having done its thing. I guess maybe the bigger news is what's not on the ballot as opposed to what will be in terms of proposed amendments and referenda. I guess at the top of the list for a lot of people is the highway tax, which the Hutchinson administration has thrown full-throated support of the half-cent sales tax. What's your sense of it?
I think good, and I worked on that issue during the session and on the legislature referring out the half penny for highway construction. I think the other issues getting the Supreme Court clearing the deck of the other issues, most of them certainly helps. The legislature still has two other initiatives that it referred out, but I think all or if close to all of the groups that were gathering signatures trying to do initiated act by voter referendum, the Supreme Court has now removed. The last one yesterday, a challenge by groups of the medical society to take off an ophthalmologist, optometrist bill. So now that that's done, I think it's a cleaner slate, and issue one, if voters understand that it's not a new tax and where the money is going to go, then I think it has a high chance of success.
Jay Barth, sense of it?
Yeah, well, I think it was a slam dunk when it was placed on the ballot back in the session when we were in a very different world. I think in 2019, the 19th session, I think the facts have changed on it. I think it's no longer as much of a slam dunk. It obviously is a continuation of a tax, but it is a permanent continuation of a tax. And I do think that it's not. I think there is economic insecurity because of the pandemic and its economic ramifications, and I think it's a different game. There is some grassroots opposition just in Little Rock because of the 30 crossing project, and so there are there is some grassroots movement against. I don't sense any major money against issue one, and there certainly is a lot of money on the pro side. So, but I do think that's a much more interesting issue than we would have thought it to be back in the spring of 2019. The other two issues I think are more coin flips in some ways. I mean, I think that on both issues, both the removal, limiting the ability of the placement of items on the ballot via petition and the alteration to term limits. I think there probably is general opposition to them, but the ballot, ballot issues are often about what the ballot title looks like, and both have fairly favorable ballot titles that I think make things more complicated there. The money is going to be on issue one, and I think that's going to be the big question of whether money can get it over the hump.
Yeah, let me go back to John Burris for a second, because I have started to pick up out in some of the northern, north central counties a lot of feeling among some voters there that this is basically a tax for Little Rock highways for the 30 Crossing project. From a marketing, from a strategic standpoint, that's not necessarily good for issue one.
No, it's not. The Highway Commission has tried to do a better job of showing the where the money spends, and over the years it's changed a lot. It used to be spent not necessarily in a totally balanced way, but that's changed a lot. The legislature has more accountability than it used to. The Highway Department has published a plan of where the dollars go, and I think that helps. And then a big part of the campaign needs to be showing voters where it goes, because it's not an open-ended black hole. It's pretty well defined, and there's a lot of transparency, whereas maybe there did not used to be. And so I think voters need to know that, because it is a statewide plan. But in the end, there's always skepticism to overcome when you're trying to talk about giving the government more money. And here I think a good campaign can overcome that, but it takes money. And to Jay's point, there is money on the proponent side. And so hopefully voters can understand and support the issue.
Well, we could go on, and we will at a future date. For right now, we're out of time. So to the three of you, thanks again for being a part of the broadcast. We'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us, and back in a week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.